Sarah Chen had always been different from other girls her age. While her classmates spent weekends at shopping malls and movie theaters, she practiced martial arts in her grandfather's small dojo behind their family restaurant. Her grandfather, Master Chen, had escaped from China decades ago, carrying with him ancient fighting techniques that few people in America had ever seen. Sarah was small for her age, barely 5 feet 2 inches tall, and weighing only 110 pounds. Her classmates often joked that she looked like she could be blown away by a strong wind. What they didn't know was that her grandfather had been training her since she was 5 years old, in a fighting style called Eagle Claw Kung Fu, a technique so rare that only a handful of masters still knew its secrets. The training was never easy. Every morning before school, Sarah would wake up at 4 a.m. to practice breathing exercises and meditation. Her grandfather taught her that true strength came from within, not from the size of muscles or the loudness of voice. He showed her how to use an opponent's weight and momentum against them, how to find pressure points that could disable someone twice her size, and most importantly, how to remain calm when everyone else was panicking. When Sarah turned 18, she made a decision that shocked everyone who knew her. Instead of going to college like her parents wanted, she decided to join the Marines. Her father was furious. Her mother cried for days, and her friends thought she had lost her mind. How could someone so small and quiet survive in the military? The day she reported to Marine Corps Recruit Depot at Parris Island, South Carolina, Sarah knew she was in for the biggest challenge of her life. The bus pulled up to the base, and she could see other recruits getting off. Most of them were men, tall and muscular, looking like they had been preparing for this moment their entire lives. There were a few women too, but even they looked stronger and more athletic than Sarah. Drill instructor Sergeant Rodriguez was the first person to greet the new recruits. He was a massive man with arms like tree trunks and a voice that could probably be heard from 3 miles away. He looked at each recruit as they lined up, sizing them up like a predator examining prey. When his eyes fell on Sarah, he stopped and stared for what felt like forever. "What do we have here?" Sergeant Rodriguez said, his voice dripping with disbelief. "Did someone's little sister get lost and accidentally end up on my base?" The other recruits started snickering, and Sarah could feel her face turning red. But she remembered her grandfather's words about staying calm and keeping her emotions under control. The first few weeks of basic training were brutal for everyone, but Sarah seemed to struggle more than most. During physical training, she was always the last one to finish runs. In the obstacle courses, she needed help getting over walls that other recruits climbed easily. When they practiced carrying heavy equipment, Sarah's small frame made her look like she was about to collapse under the weight. The other recruits started calling her tiny behind her back, though some weren't even bothering to hide their mockery anymore. During mealtimes, she would often sit alone, while groups of recruits whispered and pointed in her direction. Some of the male recruits would make comments about how she should have joined the Air Force instead, where she could sit behind a desk instead of pretending to be a warrior. Sergeant Rodriguez seemed to take special pleasure in making Sarah's life difficult. During inspection, he would find problems with her bunk that he ignored in others. During drills, he would make her repeat movements until she got them perfect, while letting others move on after sloppy attempts. It was clear that he believed Sarah didn't belong there and was trying to make her quit. But what none of them knew was that while Sarah was struggling with the physical demands of Marine training, she was also adapting and learning. Every night after lights out, she would quietly practice the breathing techniques her grandfather had taught her. She was studying the way her fellow recruits moved, learning their habits and weaknesses. Most importantly, she was waiting for the right moment to show everyone what she was really capable of. The breaking point came during the 4th week of training. The recruits were practicing hand-to-hand combat techniques, and Sergeant Rodriguez was looking for volunteers to demonstrate moves in front of the group. Sarah raised her hand, which surprised everyone, since she had been so quiet during previous training sessions. "Oh, Tiny wants to play with the big kids," Sergeant Rodriguez said with a cruel smile. "All right, let's see what you've got. Martinez, Johnson, Williams, Thompson, and Davis. You five are going to help our little friend here learn what real combat looks like. The 5 Marines he called forward were some of the biggest and strongest recruits in their group. Martinez was a former college football player who looked like he could bench press a truck. Johnson had grown up on a farm and had the kind of strength that came from years of hard physical labor. Williams was a boxer who had won several amateur competitions before joining the military. Thompson and Davis were both over 6 feet tall and had the kind of muscular build that made them look like action movie stars. Sarah looked at the 5 men standing in front of her and felt her heart start beating faster. But instead of fear, what she felt was excitement. For the first time since arriving at Paris Island, she was going to be able to use the skills her grandfather had spent 13 years teaching her. The other recruits gathered around in a circle, expecting to watch Sarah get embarrassed or possibly hurt. Some of them looked worried for her safety, while others seemed excited to finally see the quiet girl get put in her place. Sergeant Rodriguez stood with his arms crossed, a satisfied expression on his face as he prepared to watch Sarah fail spectacularly. What happened next would become the most talked about moment in the history of that particular training group, and would change how everyone looked at the small, quiet girl who had seemed so out of place among the Marines. The stage was set for Sarah to prove that sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one that everyone underestimates. Her grandfather's training was about to be put to the ultimate test, and 5 confident Marines were about to learn that size and strength mean nothing when faced with someone who truly knows how to fight. As Sarah took her fighting stance, she could almost hear her grandfather's voice reminding her that the greatest victories often come from the most unexpected sources. The circle of recruits grew quiet. The 5 Marines prepared themselves for what they thought would be an easy demonstration, and Sarah prepared to show everyone that being labeled as weak was the biggest mistake they could make. Sarah closed her eyes for just a moment and took a deep breath. In that brief second, she transported herself back to her grandfather's dojo. She could smell the incense he always burned during training, hear the sound of his calm voice explaining ancient techniques, and feel the worn wooden floors beneath her feet. When she opened her eyes, everything around her seemed to move in slow motion. The 5 Marines spread out in front of her, each one confident that this would be over quickly. Martinez cracked his knuckles loudly, a habit he had developed to intimidate opponents before fights. Johnson rolled his massive shoulders, making his muscles ripple under his uniform. Williams bounced on his feet like he was preparing for a boxing match, while Thompson and Davis exchanged amused glances, clearly thinking this was going to be entertaining. Sergeant Rodriguez raised his hand and shouted, "Begin!" Martinez was the first to move, rushing towards Sarah with the kind of aggressive charge that had worked for him on football fields. He was used to overwhelming smaller opponents with pure force and speed. What he didn't expect was for Sarah to remain perfectly still until the very last second. Just as Martinez reached her, Sarah stepped slightly to the side and grabbed his extended arm. Using a technique called borrowing force, she redirected his momentum and weight, spinning him around and using his own energy against him. Before Martinez knew what was happening, he was flying through the air and landing hard on the ground several feet away. The circle of watching recruits gasped in surprise. This wasn't what anyone had expected to see. Johnson, thinking that Martinez had just slipped or made a mistake, charged forward immediately. He was bigger than Martinez and moved more carefully, keeping his center of gravity low and his arms ready to grab Sarah. Sarah waited until Johnson was close enough that she could see the surprise in his eyes. Then, she ducked under his reaching arms and struck 2 specific pressure points on his ribs with lightning speed. Johnson's body instantly went numb, and his legs gave out from under him. He collapsed to the ground, conscious but unable to move properly, looking confused and shocked. Williams, the boxer, realized that something unusual was happening. He approached more cautiously, keeping his hands up in a defensive position and watching Sarah's movements carefully. He had experience fighting smaller opponents and knew that speed could sometimes overcome size. But Williams had never faced anyone trained in eagle claw kung fu. Sarah moved like water flowing around rocks, avoiding his punches by inches and striking back with precision that seemed almost impossible. She hit pressure points on his wrists that temporarily paralyzed his hands, making it impossible for him to continue fighting. Williams stumbled backward, staring at his hands in disbelief as they refused to obey his commands. Thompson and Davis looked at each other nervously. 3 of their fellow Marines were now on the ground or disabled, and the small girl who was supposed to be the weakest person in their group was still standing calmly in the center of the circle. Thompson decided to try a different approach. Instead of charging like the others had done, he moved slowly and carefully, trying to grab Sarah and use his superior size to wrestle her to the ground. This was exactly what Sarah had been waiting for. As Thompson reached for her, Sarah grabbed his wrist and used a technique her grandfather called snake catches mouse. She twisted Thompson's arm in a way that put tremendous pressure on his shoulder joint while simultaneously sweeping his feet out from under him. Thompson found himself on the ground, with Sarah controlling his arm in a position that would cause serious injury if he tried to move. Davis was the last one standing, and by now he realized that this wasn't going according to plan at all. He could see the shock and confusion on Sergeant Rodriguez's face, and he could hear the whispers from the other recruits who were watching in amazement. Davis was smart enough to know that whatever Sarah was doing, it wasn't normal military combat training. This was something else entirely. Something that looked almost like a dance, but was clearly devastatingly effective. He approached very carefully, trying to figure out what his best strategy might be. Sarah could see the wheels turning in Davis's mind, and she respected him for being intelligent enough to recognize that he was outmatched. But the demonstration wasn't over yet, and she needed to complete what she had started. When Davis finally made his move, trying to tackle Sarah around the waist, she used the most advanced technique her grandfather had ever taught her. It was called Eagle Soars Above Clouds, and it required perfect timing, balance, and precision. Sarah jumped up just as Davis reached her, using his shoulders as stepping stones to leap over him completely. As she passed over his head, she struck pressure points on his neck that caused him to lose consciousness for just a few seconds. Davis collapsed gently to the ground, unharmed, but completely unconscious. The entire demonstration had lasted less than 2 minutes. 5 of the strongest recruits in the training group were now on the ground, and Sarah stood in the center of the circle, not even breathing heavily. The silence that followed was deafening. Nobody moved, nobody spoke, nobody even seemed to be breathing. Sergeant Rodriguez stood with his mouth hanging open, completely unable to process what he had just witnessed. The other recruits stared at Sarah like she had just performed magic. Sarah walked over to each of the 5 Marines and helped them to their feet. She checked to make sure none of them were seriously injured and apologized quietly to each one. Martinez, Johnson, Williams, Thompson, and Davis all stood up slowly, looking embarrassed but also impressed. "Where did you learn to do that?" Martinez asked, rubbing his shoulder where he had hit the ground. "My grandfather taught me," Sarah replied simply. She didn't elaborate or brag about what had just happened. In her mind, she had simply used the tools she had been given to handle a challenging situation. Sergeant Rodriguez finally found his voice. "Chen, what the hell was that?" His tone was different now. Not mocking or dismissive, but genuinely curious, and maybe even a little respectful. "Eagle Claw Kung Fu, sir," Sarah answered. "My grandfather has been teaching me since I was 5 years old." The sergeant looked around at the 5 Marines, who were still recovering from their encounter with Sarah's skills. Then he looked back at Sarah, and for the first time since she had arrived at Paris Island, she saw something in his eyes that wasn't disapproval or disappointment. "Why didn't you tell us you could fight like that?" he asked. Sarah thought about the question for a moment before answering. "You never asked, sir. And my grandfather always taught me that it's better to be underestimated than overestimated. When people think you're weak, they make mistakes." The other recruits began to gather around Sarah, asking questions about her training and wanting to know more about the techniques she had used. The 5 Marines she had defeated were actually among the most interested, wanting to understand how someone so much smaller than them had been able to handle them so easily. Word of what had happened spread quickly through the base. Within hours, drill instructors from other training groups were coming by to hear the story and see the small recruit who had taken down 5 Marines with techniques none of them had ever seen before. But for Sarah, the most important thing was that she had proven to herself that her grandfather's training had prepared her for whatever challenges she might face. She had shown that being different didn't mean being weak, and that sometimes the quietest person in the room might also be the most dangerous. The dynamics of her training group changed completely after that day, and Sarah's real journey as a Marine was just beginning. The days following the demonstration were unlike anything Sarah had experienced since arriving at Paris Island. Instead of eating alone at meals, she found herself surrounded by recruits who wanted to hear stories about her grandfather and learn about Eagle Claw Kung Fu. Instead of being called Tiny with mockery, recruits started calling her Chen with genuine respect. Martinez, Johnson, Williams, Thompson, and Davis became some of her closest allies. They had experienced firsthand what Sarah was capable of, and they understood that they had been taught an important lesson about making assumptions. Martinez, in particular, seemed fascinated by the idea that technique could overcome raw strength. "I've been relying on my size my whole life," he told Sarah during one of their conversations. "In football, I could just run through people. I never learned how to actually fight smart." Sarah began teaching some basic techniques to her fellow recruits during their free time. She showed them pressure points that could disable an attacker, breathing exercises that could help them stay calm under stress, and balance techniques that could make them harder to knock down. But the most significant change was in Sergeant Rodriguez's attitude toward Sarah. The drill instructor, who had once seemed determined to make her quit, was now genuinely interested in her abilities. He started asking her questions about her training and even requested demonstrations of specific techniques. "Chen, I've been in the Marines for 15 years, he told her, one evening after training. "I've seen a lot of soldiers come through this program, and I've never seen anything like what you did. Where I come from, we were always taught that bigger and stronger meant better. You've made me realize that maybe I was wrong about some things." Sarah appreciated his honesty, but she also understood that her real test was still to come. The demonstration had been controlled and safe, with rules and observers. Real military situations would be unpredictable and dangerous, with no guarantee that her grandfather's techniques would be enough. That test came sooner than anyone expected. During the 8th week of training, Sarah's group was participating in a night training exercise in the woods surrounding the base. The recruits were divided into teams and given a mission to navigate through difficult terrain while avoiding enemy soldiers played by experienced Marines. Sarah was assigned to a team with Martinez, Johnson, and 2 other recruits named Kelly and Harper. Their mission was to reach a designated checkpoint without being detected by the patrol teams that were hunting them in the darkness. Everything went wrong almost immediately. Their team got separated from the main group during the first hour of the exercise. Kelly twisted her ankle badly while trying to cross a stream in the dark, and Harper developed severe stomach cramps that made it difficult for him to continue moving. To make matters worse, they could hear voices and see flashlight beams in the distance, indicating that patrol teams were closing in on their location. Martinez looked around at their injured teammates, and then at Sarah. "What do we do? Kelly can't walk, Harper can barely stand up, and we've got patrols coming from at least 2 different directions." Johnson checked his map and compass, but the heavy tree cover made it difficult to determine their exact location. "We're lost," he admitted. "I have no idea which direction the checkpoint is supposed to be." Sarah listened to the sounds in the forest around them. Her grandfather had taught her how to use all of her senses, not just her eyes, to understand her environment. She could hear the patrol teams moving through the woods, estimate their distance and direction, and identify safe paths through the terrain. "Give me Kelly," she said quietly. "Martinez, you carry Harper. Johnson, follow me and watch for obstacles." "Are you serious?" Martinez asked. "Kelly weighs at least 140 pounds. You can't carry her through these woods." But Sarah was already kneeling down next to Kelly and showing her how to position herself for a piggyback carry. What followed was one of the most amazing displays of physical and mental endurance that any of the recruits had ever witnessed. Sarah carried Kelly through dense woods, up steep hills, and across streams for over 2 miles. She moved silently through terrain that was causing Martinez and Johnson to stumble and make noise despite carrying lighter loads. Even more impressively, Sarah seemed to have an almost supernatural ability to avoid the patrol teams. She would stop suddenly and signal for the group to hide, and moments later, a patrol would pass within feet of their hiding spot. She found paths through the woods that kept them out of sight while still moving toward their objective. "How do you know where to go?" Johnson whispered during one of their brief rest stops. "My grandfather taught me to listen to the forest," Sarah replied. "Trees and streams and animals all make different sounds, depending on what's happening around them. The patrols are making noise that travels further than they realize, and I can use that to avoid them." Kelly, despite being injured and exhausted, was amazed by what Sarah was doing. "You're carrying me like I weigh nothing," she whispered. "How is that possible?" "It's about distributing the weight properly and using your core muscles efficiently," Sarah explained. "Plus, my grandfather made me carry heavy pots of water up and down stairs for years when I was growing up. He said it would build strength. I didn't know I had." After 3 hours of careful navigation through dangerous terrain, Sarah's team reached their checkpoint. They were the first group to arrive, despite having started with 2 injured team members and getting lost early in the exercise. The commanding officer who was waiting at the checkpoint couldn't believe what he was seeing. "Recruit Chen. Did you carry Recruit Kelly the entire way here?" "Yes, sir," Sarah replied simply. "And you managed to avoid all of the patrol teams?" "Yes, sir." The officer looked at Martinez and Johnson for confirmation. Both of them nodded, still somewhat stunned by what they had experienced. "I've been running these exercises for 8 years, the officer said. "Most teams that reach this checkpoint are missing at least one team member who got captured by patrols. How did you manage to bring everyone here safely?" Sarah thought about how to explain her grandfather's teachings in a way that would make sense to a military officer. "Sir, my grandfather always taught me that the best way to win a fight is to avoid fighting in the first place. We were successful because we didn't try to confront the patrols. We used patience and careful observation to find a path that kept us out of danger." Word of Sarah's performance during the night exercise spread through the base even faster than news of her demonstration had traveled. Senior officers began taking notice of the small recruit who seemed to possess skills that went far beyond normal military training. Colonel Morrison, the commanding officer of the entire training facility, requested a meeting with Sarah. She reported to his office wondering if she had somehow gotten in trouble for using techniques that weren't part of standard Marine training. "Recruit Chen," Colonel Morrison began. "I've been reading reports about your performance here, and I have to say that they're quite remarkable. Your drill instructors tell me that you've gone from being considered the weakest recruit in your group to being someone that other Marines look up to and respect." "Thank you, sir," Sarah replied, not sure where the conversation was heading. "I'm curious about your background," the colonel continued. "This eagle claw kung fu that you practice. How long did you train before coming here?" 13 years, sir. My grandfather started teaching me when I was 5 years old." Colonel Morrison leaned back in his chair, clearly impressed. 13 years. And your grandfather, where did he learn these techniques? Sarah told him about her grandfather's background in China, his escape to America, and his decision to pass on ancient fighting techniques to his granddaughter. She explained how the training had been as much about mental discipline and character development as it had been about physical techniques. "Recruit Chen, I'm going to make you an offer," Colonel Morrison said. "There are special units in the Marines that could benefit from someone with your unique skills. After you complete basic training, would you be interested in applying for advanced programs that might make better use of your abilities?" Sarah thought about the question carefully. She had joined the Marines to challenge herself and serve her country, not to become famous or receive special treatment. But she also realized that she might be able to help other Marines learn techniques that could save their lives in combat situations. "Sir, I'd be honored to serve wherever the Marines think I can be most useful," she replied. "Excellent. I'm going to arrange for you to meet with some people who specialize in unconventional warfare techniques. They're always looking for individuals who bring unique skills to the table." As Sarah left the colonel's office, She reflected on how much her life had changed since arriving at Paris Island. She had come here as someone who was labeled weak and unsuitable for military service. Now she was being recruited for special programs because of the very qualities that had made others doubt her. The remaining weeks of basic training passed quickly. Sarah continued to excel in all areas, not just combat techniques but also academics, leadership exercises, and teamwork challenges. Her fellow recruits had learned to respect her abilities, and many of them came to her for advice and guidance. On graduation day, as Sarah stood with her fellow Marines receiving their diplomas, she thought about her grandfather and how proud he would be. She had taken the ancient techniques he had taught her in a small dojo behind a family restaurant and used them to earn respect in one of the most challenging military training programs in the world. But more than that, she had proven that being underestimated could actually be an advantage. The other recruits and drill instructors had learned not to judge people based on their size or appearance, and Sarah had learned that the quiet strength her grandfather had taught her could be just as valuable as any weapon. As she prepared to begin the next phase of her military career, Sarah knew that her real journey was just beginning. The techniques that had served her well in training would soon be tested in real-world situations, where lives might depend on her ability to remain calm, think clearly, and use her skills wisely. The girl who had been labeled weak had become a Marine who understood that true strength comes from discipline, preparation, and the wisdom to know that the most powerful victories are often achieved by those who others never see coming.